Hello guys, Crispy here, welcome back to another video. In this moment, friends, I'm going to be testing the Radeon RX 588GB model in Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. This one is the XFX GTS XXX version of the card. We are running it with the latest AMD drivers, and I am overclocking it a little bit manually, as you can see. You can check out all of its specs right here in Tech Power-Up's GPU-Z. Again, it's the 8GB version of the 580, and over on the left, we're pairing it with the Ryzen 5 3600X and 32GB of DDR4 3200MHz in dual channel. Let's get into it, shall we? Let's go over the settings first. I'm playing at 1080p resolution using FSR3 on the temporal upscaler. It's set to off at the moment, so it's not upscaling anything, it's just adding sharpening. Frame generation is turned off, and we can't really turn it on inside of the game, but there is some trickery that we can do inside of the config files. I will do it later and show it to you guys. And over on the graphics settings, we're using the low settings preset at the moment, which is not minimum settings. As you can see, some things can still go lower, and then I will also try it out with the lowest settings. Let's do this. Alright, so we're here getting very low FPS, guys. Look at that. Oh, damn it. It is a cinematic experience, just like with the GTX 1060, you know. It's very, very similar to that card in this particular area here. The 1060 also dropped from like 24 frames per second. I was very surprised to see it dropping from a cinematic frame rate, you know. So yeah, the 580 seems to be doing very, very similarly to that card. The clouds, even though we're not using any upscaler at the moment, they're still shimmery as heck. I don't know why. Probably because of the low settings preset, but everything else looks extremely nice, aside from water. Like, water always looks pretty bad in this game, no matter what settings you're utilizing. The strong point is the vegetation, and as you can see, with the RX 580 8GB model, we can have some really good looking textures, even licking things from really, really close. Like, there are droplets of water on top of these things. It's really gorgeous, even on low, you know. Like, that's absolutely insane. Shadow quality isn't really amazing in most areas, but that's to be expected. It's low settings after all. Now, let's improve things with FSR3 on quality. It's set to fixed mode right here because, well, I want to use the normal FSR3 implementation, not bias it towards a 4K output resolution, because this is an RX 580 after all, right? And with FSR3 on quality, things are looking a little bit more shimmery, you know. You can definitely tell, especially at the distance. Also, the frame time graph is not really that stable. It has a lot of little spikes here and there. But as I showed with the GTX 1060, if you lock the frames to 30 or anything lower than what we're getting right here, it will be a very smooth frame time graph, and it's just going to be flat, you know. So there is definitely the possibility of playing this game with a smooth frame time graph without any stuttering whatsoever. Also, I'm very surprised to see the GPU utilization dropping sometimes. I don't know if you noticed, but over here, once we hit the water, yeah, there we go, 93%, 92%. It actually went down to 80% once, yeah, 86% right there. Why is that happening? I'm not really sure. Anyway, let's stop it right there. 41 FPS average seems a lot more reasonable than the 20 to 30 FPS that we were getting previously, and I would gladly take this experience, guys, okay? Now, what I'm gonna do is enable frame generation on top of FSR Ultra quality, because on quality, with frame generation at 1080p, it starts looking really bad. Okay, so you can find your config files under your Documents folder, My Games, and AFOP. It's very easy to find, no app data folders or anything like that. You just open this graphic settings.cfg and scroll down here, and then you see frame generation is set to false. All you need to do is type true right there, save it, and get back to the game, and FG will be enabled. Oh, look at the FPS, guys. 70s, 60s. It will probably drop down into the 50s as well. Yeah, there we go. But it is such a better experience. And the graphics still look very similar to like quality FSR, since we're using ultra quality FSR and frame generation on top of it. Maybe slightly more shimmery once again, but it was already pretty shimmery previously. The water looks a bit bad still. There is a lot of FPS drops whenever you move your camera around like this, but that could be due to the Ryzen 5 I don't know, okay, somebody told me it was a Ryzen 5. But remember, if you lock the FPS to 60 this time around, you can actually achieve a smooth frame time graph without these massive spikes whenever you turn the camera around really fast. So it's definitely possible to have a smooth experience. The main issue of frame generation is, as I'm sure you're aware of by now, the input lag. Oh my god, what the hell is happening? Well, it's the input lag and some of the artifacts that happen in the image with frame generation turned on, especially right here. This one is very, very noticeable. If I pan the camera around like this with the weapon, you can clearly see a lot of artifacting around the iron sights of the weapon. That's something that happens here with frame generation. Even at super high resolutions like 4K, it will still happen. So, unfortunately, that's what we get. But it's a minor thing, you know. At least we're getting 30 plus, like actually 50 plus or 45 plus FPS all of the time with that added input lag. But I feel like this is a better experience than just 30 FPS locked all of the time. Anyway, I'll keep this at 1080p resolution, and now... Ooh, wait a second. I'm not gonna do this. I will actually need to restart the game and turn off frame generation in the config files first, because if I touch any of the video settings here, the computer just freezes. I actually had to hard reset because I tried to turn off FSR down from fixed to off completely, you know, and yeah, that's not a good idea. Again, this is really not supported, but apparently it can handle it, so why gray out that setting, right? Oh, see that? 38, 37 FPS? Ah, that's bad. Okay, so we're back to 1080p native resolution. FSR is turned off, as is frame generation. And on the graphics settings, I manually set everything to the lowest setting. And yes, this turned on is actually the lowest setting for the shadow proxies, okay? So as you can see, there is no setting that could go lower than this, and let's see if we can get 30 FPS, please. Here we have it, guys, and nope, it is still dropping from 30 frames per second into the mid-20s very often, at least here in this area. It's a pretty intensive area, you know, but still... that is not that big of a difference, both visually and performance-wise. But yeah, you can actually get 30 plus FPS down here by the water, which is pretty interesting, because water is also pretty intensive in this game. But yeah, of course, if it does drop from 30 frames per second over there in the camp area, it will also drop whenever you are mid-fight, fighting enemies and stuff like that. I've already done a couple of missions fighting a lot of enemies, and the FPS do drop to about the same values as over there, so it's not going to be great, especially because you need to aim at things whenever the FPS are dropping the most. So we will need to enable some FSR again. I'm going to set it to fixed and quality once again, and now here we have it, 40-ish frames per second. Can we even touch 50s? Probably. All right, in some areas it will definitely touch 50 frames per second. That's a massive stir right there. It dropped our 1% lows like crazy. It was probably just a one-off again, so I'm gonna restart counting the FPS here. But yeah, as you can see, we're back to 30 plus frames per second 100% of the time here, but again, there isn't really that big of a difference compared to the low settings preset, unfortunately. I guess it's good that we get like 2 or 3 more frames per second than the low preset, but it doesn't really change the experience completely. It is a little bit smoother though, so I'll have it, you know. I will actually recommend playing like this, since it doesn't really look that different anyways. It's probably a good idea to play on very low settings instead of low settings. Around here it's getting 40s, almost touching 50 frames per second, but I still haven't seen 50. Oh, there we go, 51, 50, yep, not bad. Unfortunately, you can't really have that 60 FPS experience all of the time. Even with frame generation, we saw it drop into the 50s and sometimes even the high 40s previously, so yeah, it's not ideal. But again, maybe this is actually a better experience than what we saw with frame generation on the low settings preset, because you don't have the added input lag. This is just the input lag, normal input lag from 40-ish frames per second. It's gonna feel all right for a game like this especially. Again, the stuttering is there, likely because of the CPU. I'm not really sure about that, really. And GPU utilization is pretty low as well, which is very, very weird, once again. Now, what I'm gonna do next is, of course, enable that frame generation. Here we go, guys. Frame generation is now enabled. Quality FSR. I forgot to set it to ultra quality, but at least using these settings and quality FSR, it is getting way higher FPS than what we've seen so far. Like, it's actually touching 80 frames per second. Frame time graph is pretty smooth, considering what we've seen so far as well. Like, that is way more stable, guys, and I don't really feel the need to lock the FPS this time around. It feels pretty alright. What the heck is this? I have never seen this place before. This is weird, okay, but we need to get to camp again to see the FPS there. GPU usage, again, is hovering around like 85 to 90% most of the time, which is not amazing, but I mean, the FPS are really, really good now. And honestly, guys, it doesn't look absolutely awful, you know. It is shimmery. It has quite a lot of pop-in using the very low settings here, especially in terms of shadow pop-in. It's super noticeable sometimes. But it is getting well above 60 frames per second, so the input lag isn't really that big of an issue anymore, and it is actually very smooth. So these are the settings that I would utilize, okay? Even though we're not maxing out that GPU utilization again, probably because of a CPU bottleneck, or maybe just because of the drivers being old. I mean, I've seen this GPU doing like 90% GPU utilization, even with like a 5800X 3D in some games, so I wouldn't really be surprised if it's just drivers or something. And I didn't really try frame generation with the 1060, so I can't really compare it, but I bet the 1060 would have been way worse than this, because it was way worse than this with the settings that we've already tested without frame generation, you know. Still, I'm not really sure if I would consider buying this game with either of these GPUs, because again, you'd be looking at a low settings experience at best, and the lowest setting experience if you want the most stability out of them. And of course, you are using some FSR3 frame generation, which is not really supported. If I touch any of the settings, the computer freezes completely. So yeah, it's just... it's a little bit of a hassle, you know? Alright guys, so that little GPU utilization issue wasn't really sitting well with me, so I installed the RX 580 here with the latest AMD drivers, as well as the same overclocking settings with the i5 13600K overclocked to 5.5 GHz and 32 GB of DDR5 6000 MHz RAM. So obviously with these specs we're gonna be fully GPU bound, since even the RTX 4080 wasn't bottlenecked by the i5 in this game. So let's find out if we still have the same issues. So we're starting right away with the very low settings here, because that's where we saw the lowest GPU utilization previously. 1080p using FSR3 on quality, okay? No frame generation at the moment. And guys, we get exactly the same results and exactly the same issue. Look at that GPU utilization. It's fluctuating a little bit. 92% GPU usage there. Standing right here, I think we saw it drop to like 80% at times, and it still happens with the 13600K. 87% right there, 89%. So it is exactly the same thing, okay? We didn't have a CPU bottleneck with the Ryzen 5 3600X. Also, if you take a look at that frame time graph, it still has some really, really weird stuttering issues every now and again, even with the i5 13600K. Somebody told me that it was caused in the 1060 video by the Ryzen 5 3600X, but no, that's not the issue here. It's the same thing with the 13600K, so it can't be the Ryzen CPU's fault. It's just, again, old drivers, old GPU architecture. It's just not optimized to run this game properly. The game wasn't optimized around the RX 580, of course, so we got a lot of those little stuttering issues, as well as not full GPU utilization. Over here, it still drops to the same 30-ish FPS values that we saw previously. We see a lot more stuttering in that frame time graph, even with the 13600K. So yeah, and 80-something% GPU utilization once again. I'm still gonna try it now with frame generation, but I think we're gonna see the same 70-ish, 80-ish FPS results that we saw previously. Yep, it's getting exactly the same FPS as we saw previously, guys, in this menu at least. 1080p FSR3 set to quality, frame generation on, same lowest settings. I really thought we could bump up the FPS to like 100 here, since we were seeing 70-ish% GPU utilization with 70-ish FPS and sometimes 80 with the Ryzen 5 3600X. But here with 13600K, GPU usage is still exactly the same, 80-something%. That is crazy! Oh my gosh. And of course, the FPS are also exactly the same, and we get the same stuttering issues and so on. It's a decent experience. Once again, you could cap it to like 60 or 70 frames per second, have an acceptable input lag experience, and a smooth one in terms of visuals and visual smoothness, of course. So it's definitely an option to play like this. It doesn't look terrible, especially on a smaller monitor. But yeah, no matter what CPU you have, as long as it doesn't bottleneck the RX 580, it's gonna get the same FPS. And now that's been it for this video, my friends. Thank you very much for watching it. Jesus Christ, are these Bob's? They're probably Bob's pets, you know. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll be back soon with the GTX 1080 Ti in this game. And later on in the week, I'll test some Warzone 3 as well as some Fortnite Chapter 5. Looking forward to that as well. So stay tuned in. As always, love you all. Bye-bye.